Welcome to episode 172 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, so the word all spelled out, SEVEN health.com/172.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. So this week on the podcast, it is another guest interview, and I'm chatting with Marci Evans. So Marci is a food and body image healer. She has dedicated her career to counseling, supervising, and teaching in the field of eating disorders. She is a certified eating disorder registered dietitian and supervisor, certified intuitive eating counselor, and certified ACSM personal trainer. In addition to her group private practice and 3 adjunct teaching positions, Marci launched an online eating disorder training for dietitians in 2015 and co-directs a specialized eating disorder internship at Simmons College. She volunteers for a number of national eating disorder organizations, including the IAEDP Certification Committee, and is serving as an eating disorder resource professional for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. She has spoken locally and nationally at numerous conferences and media outlets. She loves social media, so tweet her at MarciRD, follow her on Facebook and Instagram, and check out her blog at marcird.com/blog. So I've been following Marci for a number of years. I've always really loved hearing her conversations on other podcast show, and so it was long overdue to have her on Real Health Radio, which we get into. And I'm going to just start this conversation as I outlined to Marci at the start what we're going to cover, or what I hoped we'd cover, and we stay faithful to this. Marci is a wonderful guest, so I hope you enjoy this. Here is my conversation with Marci Evans. Hey Marci, thanks for joining me on the show today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So yeah, I am really excited to have you on the show. There's a couple of areas that I want to spend the majority of our time on, and these are areas that you personally have done trainings on. There's trainings on your site for practitioners. One of them is on digestive issues and eating disorders, and the other one is on body image. I've personally done the training on digestive issues and eating disorders, and it was fantastic. The one on body image, I haven't, but it is on my list to do at some point. So that's the 2 main places I really want to focus on. And us recording this, I mean, this has been a long time coming. I think I originally got in contact with you nearly a year ago to come on the show. And at that stage, you were heavily pregnant. You were about to move house, and recording a podcast definitely was not the top of priorities. So yeah, just like how has the last year treated you? How has motherhood been? And don't feel like you have to give an Instagram-esque picture of what it's been like. I have a 2-year-old and know that it's not always plain sailing.
You know what, Chris, I was thinking about that this morning as I was, sort of mentally preparing to have this conversation with you, and thinking about how you reached out, I guess it was a year ago, and you were so understanding as I was, preparing for the kind of last couple of months of work before my maternity leave, and things were feeling, fairly overwhelming. And then I actually ended up, I can't even remember if I shared this with you, I ended up giving birth to my son prematurely. So I ended up very, very suddenly developing preeclampsia and becoming very sick very quickly. And so my son arrived, and we spent a very long time in the NICU. And so I ended up taking an extended maternity leave. I took more time off than I had initially intended to, and I'm very, very, very grateful that I was able to take that extra time. So I would say the first 2/3 of the maternity leave were filled with time spent in the NICU, and a very scary time, actually. There were, of course, moments of happiness and joy, but it was also very scary, very anxiety-provoking, in ways traumatizing. and which actually makes me feel very grateful for my connectedness in the mental health profession and the amazing support that I had during that time, and was able to take extra time for myself and for my family. And I'm really grateful to say that I was able to transition back to work this past summer, and I'm very, very privileged because I've been able to work reasonably. Of course, I'm working a lot, but at a pace and at a time that felt right. So I was able to come back to work and feel present and not feel distracted by sort of what were the previous months of stress, and get to a really good place. And my son is doing very well, and we live in Boston, which means we have our nation's best medical care. We've had incredible providers. I've had wonderful support, and now I feel like I'm finally to the place where we're managing the normal challenges instead of the sort of additional challenges of all these kind of medical things we were working with. So, challenges in childcare and, sudden unexpected things that always arise with having a child, that it's in juxtaposition with what was a really scary start. And I guess the silver lining is that it helps me to hold my perspective so I can laugh a little bit more with the, poop explosions and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. And what does an extended break mean? Because I think there's a big difference between the US system and then the UK system over here.
Oh, that is so true. Thank you for reminding me of that. So I would say most typical in the United States is, and not everybody is able to take this much time, is 12 weeks. I had originally planned on 4 months. And, so many of my colleagues were applauding me and good for you for taking all that time off. And so I ended up taking 6 months really totally off. I was very, very separated from my work. I was not responding to emails. I was not on social media. I was really doing nothing work related, which for at least an American entrepreneur is fairly unheard of. Yep. So, yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, yeah, because I think pretty standard, and I don't want to make some assumptions over here, but yeah, it's more at the end of a year is kind of more the normal end of the spectrum. Just because of that's how the system is set up. And yeah, it's I always feel sorry when I'm like, hearing of people who have to, after 6 weeks and 8 weeks, just go back to work. And that's kind of considered the normal length of time.
Yeah. Yeah, we saw that in the NICU, actually. I made some connections there of people who were back to work in that amount of time, in 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and they were, changing shifts with their partner as they were both working and trying to spend time in the NICU and care for other children. And so I felt extremely grateful that I was able to full-time be present in the parenting process and in the recovery process. But, there are certainly, we won't go down the rabbit hole of this conversation, but some real problems, certainly within the U.S. system, which what I'm more familiar with around parental leave.
Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely. And just because of my own experience with my partner, I know how long it takes to recover. Like, it's a big thing that the body has gone through, and 6 to 8 weeks does not seem like an amount of time to A, the human body recover, and B, for you to get into the new facet of life that is looking after a new helpless child.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I felt ready enough at 6 months to come back, and it was time for a number of reasons. But people would ask me and say, are you dying to get back to work? And I said, no. I love my job. I really enjoy the work that I do, and I could have easily been content with taking more time and spending more time as a full-time mom. But I'm also very fortunate to return back to a routine and work that gives me a lot of satisfaction, and to also have spent so many years doing what I'm doing to move into something that I feel, reasonably competent in and that felt familiar, I think in ways was also a positive for me, going through so much that was unexpected. And like you said, transitioning to parenthood is always filled with things that are unexpected and new, and it's challenging in ways that are unpredictable. And so there was an element of, I think, the familiarity of my work that was in ways very grounding that I didn't necessarily expect. And so that ended up being, I think, a positive.
Yeah. And I from my perspective, that definitely was a big help for me as well. So look, we've kind of started off in a way I don't normally start off with a client sort of in that sort of area. But yeah, why don't you give listeners then sort of more of an official background on you in terms of what you do, who you are, what sort of training you've done?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. And I would just invite you, Chris, to interrupt me at any time or interject or invite me to move along faster or slow down based on what you think might be interesting. So I am a registered dietitian. I have my undergraduate degree in nutrition and dietetics, and did my 8-month internship in California, actually at Cal State Long Beach, where I did a little bit of graduate work. And I was very, very fortunate, actually, in my schooling because I had the opportunity to do a rotation at an eating disorder treatment facility. And prior to that rotation, I really had a sort of vague idea of what I thought I wanted to do as a dietitian. But it wasn't until that rotation that I realized how resonant eating disorders work was for me. There were aspects of it that felt really, really interesting. And what I couldn't have named at the time, but have the understanding now, was more of the psychological lens of food and eating and relationship to food and body. I really loved that it was multidisciplinary in nature. And so I got to get a little bit of a taste for it during that rotation. And that really changed the trajectory of my career. It was at that point that I was introduced to the book Intuitive Eating for the first time and was considering concepts that had not been introduced to me previously. And so when I wrapped up my internship, I ended up taking a job. I was living on the West Coast in the States at the time and was doing preventative wellness work, but was really weaving in kind of my own self-learning around intuitive eating and size acceptance and weight-inclusive care. And after that first job, I ended up taking a pause because I moved abroad. Actually, I lived in Germany for a year and a half. And it was during that time that I really went into full self-study mode and immersed myself in eating disorders, counseling work, weight-inclusive practice, intuitive eating. And that just really informed the rest of my career and sort of where I'm at today. And I ended up moving back to the States, back to actually out to the East Coast in Boston, where I pursued my master's degree and was able to do a really cool program at Northeastern where I was able to kind of create my own master's degree where I blended together eating disorders counseling along with business entrepreneurship. And as I was wrapping up my master's degree, I was juggling several things at the time. I was actually working at an athletic club where I was trying to work in a way that was in alignment with my values, but was really feeling like it wasn't, no big surprise, the right audience. Yep. They were like, that's all nice and good, but I really wanted you to help me lose those last 10 pounds. But I was also working at an eating disorders treatment facility at a higher level of care, and I was starting my private practice. So there were 6 months there that were a really sort of just a really intense juggle. But in that time, I was getting more and more clear about where I was passionate and how I wanted to spend my time. And that's really been kind of the past decade for me has actually been in private practice, providing nutrition counseling, individual counseling for folks in recovery from eating disorders, disordered eating, and those who might not be diagnosed with an eating disorder but have a long dieting history. And in that time, I have become very passionate, as you indicated, about empowering other dietitians to do this work. I see the role of the dietitian as being integral, and we often lack training. in this field. And so I wanted to make training more accessible to registered dietitians. And I think it was also kind of the entrepreneurial part of me as well.
Yeah.
Designed, currently 3 online courses. I'm really heartened to hear that you learned some things and found the training on digestive health and eating disorders useful to you. I'd be interested to hear about your experience there. And provided a general training on nutrition counseling for eating disorders. And as you mentioned, another training with my colleague, Fiona Sutherland, on body image and doing body image work across the spectrum. It's not with a focus on eating disorders, and it's certainly available to all clinicians. These aren't trainings for dietitians specifically, but it is with that lens in mind because I am a dietitian. And my most recent project that has been ongoing for the past, 4 years has been at the academic level, working at Simmons University here in Boston with my mentor and my colleague, Lisa Pearl. And we had been invited by the Simmons Dietetic internship to collaborate together and to build a specialized dietetic internship around eating disorders, which is the second in the United States. And it's been an honor, and it has been a joy, and it has been tremendously exciting to build specialized rotations for young students to get training in eating disorders. And then we have also the opportunity to teach a graduate level course each semester on nutrition counseling for eating disorders. And it is profoundly gratifying to see our students go and make differences in their own realm and joining the field. And, my hope is that we will continue to train dietitians to not only know how to work in the field of eating disorders, but continue to elevate the role of the dietitian, which I think unintentionally in ways has been minimized over the past 2 decades in the field. So we're trying to reshape a bit the role of the registered dietitian and what we have to offer in nutrition counseling, which is do far more than provide an exchange-based meal plan.
Yeah.
And you can hear how I could get into a bit of a soapbox there, so I'll pause and let you talk.
Cool. So yeah, there's a lot you said there that I want to go back through. So, and it's interesting for you in terms of getting into eating disorders and as an eating disorder dietitian so early on in your career, because for a lot of people who have had on this podcast who are dietitians, that side of things seems to come much later, maybe after they've been doing weight loss with people for many years and they have some light bulb moment or something happens that makes them sort of change course. But it almost sounds like pretty much from word go you're heading in that same direction. Is that right?
Yeah, that's accurate. Yeah, I think I am very fortunate that I did have the unique experience of being exposed so early, and certainly that it really has informed my entire career. I never worked within the traditional sort of weight-centric model. Even in my first job where I was trying to figure things out, I was hired in this preventative wellness department at this outpatient medical clinic, but I really happened to be working with an exercise physiologist who also had been introduced to intuitive eating. And so we designed a whole program that really tried to approach health and wellness from a non-weight focused lens, not to say at all that we did it perfectly, or I certainly would have done it very differently now, being, much later in my career. But I was doing the best with the information that I had. And I think that is different than the vast majority, I think, of health professionals, but certainly for dietitians. And I was had my own experiences in high school and in college or university where my relationship to food was not at its best. And I, had my own ways of struggling. I never had a diagnosable eating disorder, but certainly had enough dysfunctional ideas about food and sort of struggles with eating, particularly my freshman year of college. And I sort of worked through that through my college years in a way that was almost in alignment with intuitive eating, but didn't know about intuitive eating. So I do think I had a bit of a bias in my own sort of lived experience of reading a book that so reflected what was very positive and healing for me and moving away from the restriction mentality, that it clicked very, very quickly. I read the book for the first time and I was like, oh my gosh, this is sort of laying out in this so well articulated things that I had sort of figured out and sort of muddled my way through over the past few years.
Yeah, because that was going to be one of the other questions, was just thinking about like what your experience with food had been. And it sounds as though you said like late teens going into college, university, that there was more of an issue. But in terms of growing up, how was food in your household? How were siblings or parents and their relationship with food?
Sure. I am extremely fortunate. I grew up in a home with a mom who certainly has thin privilege. However, we know that thin privilege does not protect necessarily a person from dieting and body hatred. But my mom really had a very easy relationship to food. We did not have dieting language or dieting in our household. In fact, I look back and laugh at how nutrition was just not high on the priority list. I would say we always had family meals, wonderful, warm family meals. But my mom would make things like chicken Dorito casserole and, shake and bake with white rice, and we'd pour soy sauce on it, or, ham and scalloped potatoes. And we most often ate really sugary breakfast cereal. So I don't know how well this will translate to your international audience, but, I was eating Lucky Charms and Fruit Loops and Eggo waffles for breakfast. And my mom didn't like packing lunches, so we ate school lunches. No foods were off limits. I mean, I would walk myself with my friends to the convenience store and use my $2 to buy, chips and candy bars and sit in the aisle reading teen magazines. I mean, it was I look back and it really gives me a big smile on my face because I was so uninhibited around food.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until sort of my preteen years I really got into dancing and the dance world. And so that's where things started to get a little bit confusing for me, because I had this very free relationship with food at home and even my friends. And on our dancing breaks, we'd go to Burger King and eat chicken fingers and French fries. But then we began to get these messages about food and bodies by our dance instructors. And I think that's when things started to get a little bit muddled inside of my own mind. And then you start to get exposure to alternative ideas socially. And so when I look into kind of moving into those teenage years where things started to become, I think, a little bit more difficult, it had much more to do with sort of social exposure to what other girls were doing in the dancing community more than anything else. But I think that I know that I have a lot of gratitude with the ease in which I was raised around food, because I think it was very, very, very protective for me. I think I have naturally a lot of temperaments that would make me vulnerable to the development of an eating disorder. So I see my family life as being incredibly protective for me. So I have a lot of gratitude for that.
And so how did you then become interested in deciding to become a dietitian? Like, are you naturally the sciencey kid? Was it that preoccupation with food at that point in your life that put you in that direction?
It's a great question. I think it was a couple of things. I was naturally the sciencey kid. I've also always been incredibly social and had a natural interest in working with people. And so when I was in my sort of later high school years, I started thinking a little bit about, I'm going to be going to college and what do I want to study? And I had learned about occupational therapy or physical therapy from a movie I had watched, and that was really intriguing to me. I was certainly aware of maybe nursing as a potential profession, but I realized that I had a very, very, very limited bandwidth for dealing with things like needles and blood and bodily fluids. And I thought, I actually don't think that I have the nervous system to handle working in the medical field, and I really did not like the idea of medical school. And it was a part of it. I think there was a little bit of that food obsession piece that was creeping in, in my sort of later teen years. And I loved to bake. I baked cookies like all of the time for friends and family. So I definitely had an interest in food. So there was that piece in there. But what was really the main pivotal point for me was a conversation that I had with an uncle who I'm still close to, who has type 1 diabetes. And he said, Marci, you're getting ready for college. What do you think you want to study? And I said, I don't know. I really like science and I want to help people, but I don't know about becoming a nurse. And he said, well, you should think about becoming a registered dietitian. And I said, well, I've never heard about that. What is that? And he said, well, I work with a dietitian and she teaches me how to dose my insulin and how to keep my blood sugars in control to keep me healthy. And he showed me his insulin pump. And I was like, it was like this whole world opened up of possibility, and that I could talk about food and health and help people in science. It was so exciting to me. And this is sort of reveals my age a bit. I went home and I drove myself to the public library and I checked out a book on registered dietitians. Google was not a thing. And I read the book and I went to my first day of my freshman year and I knew exactly what I was going to study. And so from day one, I was very clear about becoming a dietitian. However, I will say it was fraught during my undergraduate. There was a time when I thought I'm in the wrong major. I hate my food science classes. I don't really even particularly enjoy learning about community nutrition. I really like my anatomy and physiology courses. Should I change majors? It was a bit of a bumpy roller coaster, but decided to stay the course. But as I had mentioned, I was doing this actually very cool dietetic internship where I had exposure to so many different options as a dietitian, and every rotation I said, that's interesting and I have no interest in pursuing that. And it was really like I was feeling a little frantic about it because I thought I wanted to be a clinical dietitian. And in my clinical rotations, I really did not excel at all. I felt very discouraged. I often felt confused. I didn't feel very effective. I think part of it was I didn't get great training in my clinical rotations, but I thought, oh no, like this is what I imagined myself to do. And now that I'm doing it, I don't like it at all. And gratefully, I had randomly been assigned to this eating disorders rotation, and it was sort of like it all clicked together. And I realized that as much as I did and do still love science, I am also very, very interested in psychology and relationships just as much. So it, for me, ended up being the perfect blend, but I did absolutely not know that when I started as a student.
Yeah, and that's, what you're describing there is the part that I like as well, where it is that the sciencey side of things in terms of understanding food or understanding physiology, but it's then more the human aspect of it, the messy side of understanding why people do what they do and how they think and the psychology of it, and bringing those two things together. Like, that is really exciting for me. If it was just straight up nutrition, I find that pretty dry.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I love as a dietitian who works in private practice that I have so much latitude in how we can explore food. I think I would be feeling burnt out and probably would have left the field if I was in a position where it was really much more solely focused on nutrients and nutritional science, or sort of, portions of food or designing meal plans. I think that there is a place for that, absolutely, and not to minimize that part of the nutrition profession, but knowing that there is so much more to explore and to be curious about is very exciting for me.
Yeah. And you said that it was kind of a little bit of a bumpy road as you went through that. And maybe some of that was to do with you not knowing where you wanted to end up, and maybe some of that was to do with the actual course and what was being taught or how it was being taught. And you said before, like, showing your age, okay, you obviously studied quite a while ago. Mm-hmm. Do you, and maybe this is just a ginormous question that would take a whole podcast to answer, but do you think dietetics is getting better in terms of the training that is being offered and what you would like to see be offered based on your preferences around health at every size and intuitive eating and all of those leanings?
I think that my guess would be that on the whole, there have likely been some positive strides, but I still continue to feel so discouraged in how little training there is, certainly in exposure to concepts like weight-inclusive care, to intuitive eating, but also in general, just the counseling process.
Yeah.
I train now dietetic students at the graduate level. Often they're in their first or second year of their master's degree. And without fail, the feedback is, how am I not learning this until right now? How is it that I have gone through 4 and 5 years of my training and I have never once heard these things? And there's a part of me that feels a little bit of, I'm not even sure what the exact emotion is, maybe trepidation or my own anxiety of, I'm really shaking things up for them in a way that is unsettling and I think perhaps can feel confusing because, they've been trained in a very specific model and, then I show up and really shake things up. And so that saddens me. I yearn for training of dietitians that certainly introduces concepts that are more embodied rather than just sort of top-down head knowledge. We are so grilled into the science piece, which is incredibly important. And it is missing the other components of appetite, of thoughts and beliefs around food, about how we connect to other people. It is just totally and completely devoid. In fact, I was just speaking at a conference a couple of days ago, and I was speaking with my co-presenter who works in an academic setting in Canada, and I was fascinated by what she shared, this little anecdote that she had all of her students draw a picture of the ideal dietitian. And one of the students drew a giant brain with sort of open arms extending out from the brain, sort of demonstrating openness to learning and knowledge, which on the one hand, I love the visual of sort of open arms, but this idea of the perfect dietitian is this bodiless brain did not escape my attention. And I was, giving a talk on body image, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so symbolic of the ways that we are taught, dietitians are taught to be, right? Is this very intellectualized approach to food and eating, which is, it makes me sad. I think we have a long way to go.
Yeah. And I would agree with you totally on that. And when I just think about myself and using the books I read as a proxy, if I go across the, 10 years, 11 years, however long I've been doing this, at the start, it was so much more heavily skewed towards the science and books around food and all of that. And now, I could go a year and barely read a book on that topic because there's so many other parts that I want to read about. And a lot of what I focus on now is just how to be a better practitioner, how to be better at being in a room with someone, how to be better to have better conversations and to have difficult conversations, and all of these really important facets of being a dietitian or being a practitioner. If you're sitting with someone one-on-one and having to help them in whatever way they need help, because it's not about me as the expert just telling them all of these great ideas. It's just a lot more of a messy process than that.
Oh gosh, I couldn't agree more. And yes, we have our training in, anatomy and physiology and nutritional science and, what happens with digestion and all of that. And those things are wonderful. And it becomes really kind of meaningless if we don't have the capacity to connect on the human level. And if we don't have the capacity to really trust that our clients or our patients have embodied knowledge and lived knowledge that is as valuable, more valuable than what we bring to the table as sort of from the nutritional science lens. And it is that capacity to connect and be in relationship, and the give and the take and the listening, being able to actually really, really listen. And those are not skills that I was taught in any way, shape, or form as a student. Yeah. I remember very clearly the very first patient I saw, and I had finished my dietetic internship, hours of training, and I was terrified because I had no idea how to be in a room with another human being, how to do the job of a dietitian. I knew the science. I did not know how to be a counselor. And so that is, a big piece of what I try to bring into my trainings is, how to have conversations and be in relationship with, and how to support and help people.
Yeah. Definitely. So look, I think we could stay on that topic for quite a while, but I'm going to just shift into the two main areas that I mentioned at the top.
Wonderful.
So let's start with digestive complaints and eating disorders, and maybe with the basics with that. So like, why are digestive issues so common with eating disorders, and not just eating disorders, but in the recovery of eating disorders? Because it's not like the symptoms disappear simply because someone starts the recovery journey.
Yes. Thank you so much for the lead in and for framing it in the way that you did, because that's incredibly accurate. So, I'm having about 3 different streams of thought. So what piqued my interest as an outpatient provider is that I am working with people typically in sort of the latter stages of their recovery. Perhaps they are less symptomatic than a client would be, say, at residential level of care. And historically, the sort of party line from the eating disorders community is just sort of stick through the refeeding process, reduce your eating disorder symptoms, and all of the GI stuff is going to get better. And I was sitting with my clients and I'm like, this is just not their experience. This is, continuing to have GI issues long after they're no longer engaging in restriction or binging or purging of any kind. And so I was so invested in trying to better understand these digestive complaints because it was almost universal in my practice. And I was having a conversation with a close colleague of mine who is a digestive health dietitian, with an interest in eating disorders. And I really felt I was an eating disorder specialist with an interest in GI complaints. And so we started doing this sort of cross supervision with one another. And she began sharing with me data and information that was so jaw-dropping and so important. I said to her, her name is Lauren Deere. She's phenomenal. I said, Lauren, we have to start speaking about this because this is such an issue for our field and there's so little discussion on it. And you have such important information to share. And that's when I did really, really, really deep dives into the literature and to understand the intersection. That's the thing that I'm really, really curious about, is this intersection. And one of the common questions that people have is, do GI issues make a person vulnerable to an eating disorder, or does the eating disorder cause the GI issues? And the answer is yes and yes. It's not the chicken or the egg, it is both. So we see in the literature that individuals who have the risk factors for the development of GI complaints, particularly functional GI issues, which we can talk about what that means, are temperamentally more vulnerable to the development of an eating disorder. And that was the piece that, oh my gosh, really, really hooked me in. And that when you look at this intersection between particularly these functional GI complaints and eating disorders and the physiology that is shared, that what you look at that is common to that overlap are the temperamental traits, the psychological comorbidity. And what I mean by that are things like depression and anxiety. So that is really kind of the common thread. And when you look at the data, it is just astounding when you see the number of people, the sort of prevalence rates of people with eating disorders who also have a GI diagnosis in some studies is as high as 98%.
Yeah.
And so that was the piece that I was like, we have got to be talking about this. And
with that piece where the GI issues predate the eating disorder? Because I guess in my mind, it's very easy to look at, okay, cool, you've come in, and if I'm taking anorexia or a restriction as an example, if you're in a situation where calories have been brought down, there's less resources going to all of the different systems within their body, it's then not that surprising that you would have digestive issues, because there's just not the same energy to be able to run your digestive system. But what you're saying is a lot of the time that predates them then having the eating disorder.
Yes, yeah. And of course, not always. We see both. But this is why when I do my clinical assessments, I always ask my clients about their histories. And if they're, discussing or sort of talking about GI complaints, I'm asking about it from a developmental perspective and looking at family histories. And if we think about it, it makes perfect sense that we have a child who is maybe temperamentally, naturally quite anxious or a worrier, that often tummy aches and sort of anxious stomach can go in tandem with that. Individuals who have digestive issues, oh my gosh, it's so painful and it's so intrusive and it's so can really impact quality of life that I think naturally and understandably there's a desire to fix those symptoms. And the fastest conclusion that is often drawn is, well, it's caused by what I'm eating. And so I'm going to try taking this out, or I'm going to try taking this out. And if you take someone who's a very good rule follower or very perfectionistic, they're going to be very, very good at taking those foods out. And it can be a bit of a sort of spiraling into that rabbit hole where you have temperamentally someone who's maybe very anxious, very perfectionistic, perhaps more on the rigid side, a little bit more of a black and white thinker, coupled with, complaints of, having an upset stomach. They begin taking food out. And if they have that genetic vulnerability for an eating disorder, it's a bit like a perfect storm. It really can set someone up. In fact, I didn't know this. I had been in the field of eating disorders for a number of years, attended countless conferences, and I had never heard anyone give a talk naming a primary risk factor for the future development of an eating disorder are early childhood eating and GI problems. And I stumbled in my literature search on this article that listed the top common risk factors looking at risks for development of eating disorder, and one of the first risk factors named was early childhood eating and GI problems. And I thought, oh my gosh, why aren't we talking about this? How do we get the word out that these are kids who are going to be very vulnerable to the development of an eating disorder, longer down the line. And as you mentioned, it can happen in the flip. Someone could stumble into an eating disorder, and because that naturally does damage to the digestive organs and the digestive process, you can end up with GI complaints in that direction as well.
And it's interesting with the vulnerability piece where, okay, this is a primary vulnerability to ending up with an eating disorder. My worry now, given the climate that we live in and just this hyper focus on diet and health and just the way that these ideas are disseminated through social media, and this just makes it so much more likely that if someone has digestive issues early on, that they're going to start to try and follow a ketogenic diet or go carnivore or whatever it may be, that then kind of leads them down that path probably more than would have happened, I don't know, in the 70s or 80s, because it's just not so, it wasn't so front of mind in the way that diet is these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And that dieting is this sort of, and diet culture is this shape shifter, right? And now it's presented in the form of, having this halo effect and framed in this very positive way that it is unconditionally a quote unquote good thing to be removing certain things from your diet. And it is not without risk. And I am so appreciative of my digestive health colleagues who are really getting this. I'm not sure if you've ever followed the work of Kate Scarlatta. She's fairly known here in the U.S. She is a digestive health dietitian, and she has done a remarkable amount of work around IBS and the FODMAP diet, and she does so responsibly. She actually, this big conference I just mentioned, gave a talk and talked about the risks of elimination diets and being overly rigid and taking things out. And my messaging is that is, the approach of last resort, that we know actually to have a healthy gut, we want to have the diversity of food and how important that is physiologically, but also psychologically. And, my message with the training is, and as I've had opportunities to speak on this topic, is that we have so many tools in the toolbox when it comes to supporting digestive health, and altering nutrition and taking foods out is one tool and should be used very, very carefully. And it's not to say that it isn't ever important for people with food allergies or food intolerances. Sometimes that is incredibly critical. And I believe that. And I think it is way overused, way overused, and in the hands of the public is taken very liberally, and it's sort of jumping to food as the culprit, and large food groups are taken out, and it creates so many problems, sometimes full-blown eating disorders and sometimes not. Yeah. But it certainly creates problems.
Okay. Well, she is a new name to me, so I'm going to check her out and then see if I can get her on the podcast and have a conversation about it, because that sounds super interesting.
Yeah, she's incredibly skilled, and she knows the science like nobody's business. And she would never call herself an eating disorder specialist, but we've had such a wonderful relationship over the years. We actually co-authored an article in a U.S. Dietetics magazine, really with that sentiment of being so careful about food restriction and food elimination. She has such a sensitivity to that, and I've been so appreciative of her because she has a very, very wide reach and is reaching other professionals who don't work in the realm of eating disorders. So naturally, eating disorder clinicians are very, very careful about food restriction, and so she has done such a great job of communicating that message to other people.
So one of the terms you mentioned before in passing was functional GI disorders. So yes. What do you mean by the term functional GI disorder?
Yeah, this is functional GI disorders are incredibly common, and really the distinction of a functional gut disorder is that there are symptoms or diagnoses that are a result of essentially poor communication between your head brain and what's happening in your digestive tract. So I think of it as a communication issue rather than a physiological issue. So with celiac disease, we can actually look at the inside of the intestines, look at the villi, and see, wow, there has been actual physical damage to the structure of the intestines. But that's actually not the case with these functional gut disorders. You can't look inside someone's GI tract and see that damage has been done. And so it's, again, an issue more of a function and communication. So these are actually disorders that people are very familiar with. It has to do with, say, reflux. It has to do with just general bloating, constipation, diarrhea, kind of sort of this nebulous stomach pain. It sort of falls into the category often of people feeling like, my doctor tells me nothing is wrong, but I know there's something wrong. My stomach isn't working right. IBS falls under this category. So it's often these symptoms that feel very, very hard for people to live with because there isn't often a sort of clear diagnosis.
Right. And so what would be like the way of dealing with something that's a functional GI disorder versus something that is more like a celiac disease?
Mm-hmm. Of course, it's going to depend upon diagnosis, but in my experience working with GI issues, that for individuals where there is, say, a diagnosis like celiac disease or, say, Crohn's disease falls under this category, in that you have a really clear idea of what is wrong, but often, even in the case of Crohn's disease, the sort of what to do about it can be fairly complicated. In the case of, say, celiac disease, it is so not fun, but the treatment removing, right, of gluten is fairly straightforward. Where in the case of these sort of functional disorders, we have to be incredibly creative, and I find that we have to use lots of different tools. Sometimes it is looking at the pacing of meals and the timing of meals. Sometimes it's looking at maybe the texture of foods that a person is eating. Sometimes we are looking at different medications that can provide relief. Other times we're looking at managing stress and anxiety. And that is the piece that I think is often underaddressed. Yep. And the piece that I like to highlight, because with these functional gut disorders, like I said, they're an issue of communication between head and gut brain, which means it's related to our nervous system. So if we aren't attending to the function of our nervous system, we are likely not going to have particularly great outcomes because we're not addressing and paying attention to some of the underlying causes of the symptoms.
And the thing with that is, as an eating disorder goes on and someone becomes fearful of eating or eating particular foods, and food then gets labeled as a threat, you then have basically the nocebo effect, where eating a particular food creates a symptom because of the psychological beliefs or thoughts around that food, and so you get kind of stuck in that place where it's like, okay, how do I get through this and get to a place where I'm no longer fearful of that food, when in reality, every time I eat it, I get genuine symptoms.
Yes. Yeah, it can be quite challenging. And what I hope that I do as a clinician working with my clients is validate their real life experience in their body and to really listen to what their experience is. And I think often clients who suffer with these types of symptoms receive feedback from clinicians, particularly when from the medical community, where there's a known eating disorder, it's all in your head, it's a mental patient. I mean, people who are just so disregarded and poorly treated. And so and this is where I bring the science in, is to say this is real and it's alive in your body, and that you are having physical symptoms, some of which is connected to your emotional experience and your thoughts related to eating. And so that might not be the whole entire picture, but we can appreciate that it's part of the picture. And if we can work on this part, I will hope and expect that we will see some of these symptoms downregulate and be less troublesome for you. And so I try to really hold the whole picture. And if someone is very clear, Marci, every single time I have a glass of milk, here's my experience. Okay, all right, let's work on that and let's try a lactose-free milk. It's not as if I'm totally opposed to working on sort of shifting certain foods around, but I'm hoping to do that in tandem with lots of different approaches, and that we are expanding what is being eaten rather than contracting and restricting. Yeah. And, and I have found that my clients are often very, very receptive, especially as we're in this open dialogue with one another. And often where I try to begin with my clients as much as possible is some of the low-hanging fruit of the eating disorder symptoms, which will guarantee to cause GI distress. So if that is eating large volumes of quote unquote safe foods, like someone's eating a handful of apples for their afternoon snack, or eating lots of raw kale, that's going to be rough on anyone's digestive system. Or maybe they're consuming a lot of sugar alcohols trying to avoid calories. So they're eating a lot of diet foods, or chewing a lot of gum, or drinking a lot of beverages with artificial sweeteners. That I provide that education that all of those sugar alcohols are going to cause a lot of bloating. So can we work on decreasing the eating disorder behaviors that will support recovery of the eating disorder, but also recovery of the digestive complaints? Yeah. And often people are very on board with that, or going long stretches of time without eating. That is so disruptive to normal GI functioning and sort of the rhythm of the gut and how it likes to move things along in a rhythmic fashion. So I find that when I bring in a lot of empathy, a really open listening ear, along with some science and along with some things that I think will give us sort of a big bang for the buck, that we can start kind of chipping in there.
Yeah, and I would agree with you on that. I mean, they are the things that where you see a pretty quick turnaround. And with eating disorders, a lot of things take a long time, and you've got to kind of persevere and all that.
Yes.
But I would say getting someone to decrease their vegetable intake when they're eating plates of vegetables every night, by doing that within a short space of time, I'm talking a couple of days, a week, people really notice a difference.
Yes. And like you said, you sort of highlighted so well, it's not that that's easy for someone who's in the throes of an eating disorder. It can feel psychologically very complicated and can take time. And when they can notice that they can start to feel better, that can really create a positive feedback loop. I had a client who I worked with for many years, and she had numerous GI complaints, no, clear diagnosable GI condition. And, she had forwards and sort of relapses, sort of forward movement and recovery and relapses. And I can tell you that when she was able to nourish herself consistently, eat in a balanced way, not abuse Diet Coke, take her medications responsibly, that most of her symptoms improved. Now, I want to appreciate that you will have listeners and say, that's not my experience. Of course, that's unfortunately not going to be the experience for everyone. But for individuals sort of in that space of eating disorder and digestive health, that's saying, what are the things that I can work on that are going to support me in both of these areas, can be very, very helpful without getting too preoccupied with what do I need to be taking out.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I feel like so much of recovery is a little bit of blind faith of like, okay, this will get better in time. Whereas with this one, there is just more of I am noticing that my bloating's not as bad as it used to be, or I notice my stools have got better in a week.
Yeah, and one of the things, and I'm not sure how much you want to discuss this today, that I think where we as practitioners can feel so insufficient is that there are still a lot of unanswered questions. We're just barely being able to look at research that is done on folks in recovery from eating disorders and the consequences of altering the gut microbiome.
Yeah.
And we do know, this for me really points to the dilemma that I'm often in with my clients, where we're doing all the work that we can do and we have these persistent GI symptoms, and it breaks my heart and it feels so frustrating to me. And I do think that we are going to learn more over the coming decades about the role of the gut microbiome, because we do know, particularly food restriction in the context of an eating disorder, that it does disrupt a healthy microbiome, that you see a decrease in the amount of bacteria as well as a decrease in diversity. And one of the sort of mind-blowing pieces of research that I stumbled upon, which you learned about in the training, maybe you knew about previously, is that individuals who are nutritionally in a better place through eating disorders treatment, that their gut microbiome more closely resembles individuals with functional gut disorders. And so we know that on, at a very basic level, there is healing that remains even after symptoms are improved. And so I think there's a lot that we need to learn about how do we fully heal the gut microbiome, and will that produce improved symptoms from a GI perspective? So I'm hopeful there. I'm optimistic.
Yeah. And then how do you talk about that where it doesn't become across as just diety? Because so much of the chat around microbiome then is talked about, and this is why you need to do paleo, or this is why you need to cut all these foods out of your diet. Like how you can then take what comes out of that and do it in a way that is constructive to someone who's recovered from an eating disorder.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And how we can quickly go down a line of thinking that's unproductive. And from my standpoint, in conversations that I have with my clients, is that there is so much that we don't understand, and that quickly applying early stage research to real life is a particularly precarious thing to do, particularly when we're also treating an eating disorder, right? I just saw a headline in the news that said something to the effect of, oh, too much prebiotics are actually causing more problems. And so we're very quick to take a nutritional science headline and run with it. Yeah. And that's where we sort of lean into. And one of my passion areas is when we're looking at an eating disorder plus a medical diagnosis, we're thinking very big picture around what is going to support both. Yeah. And, we ride that together sort of as a clinician and client. And often what is the case is something that is going to be much more moderate than any type of eating pattern that is proposed, in an extreme way, whether it's intermittent fasting or whether it's eliminating massive food groups, that is physiologically in the long term we don't have great evidence for. And also we know in the short term it's psychologically pretty problematic and non-sustainable for most people, not just people with eating disorders.
Yeah. Definitely. And with all of those things, even if it turns out to be true that intermittent fasting is helpful for a subset of the population, I've always got to look at cost, rewards, upside downside of something. Okay, potentially this could be useful for someone, but the downside is this could potentially drive someone to an eating disorder. Mm-hmm. And so no matter how amazing it may be on paper, it's let's think yes. about this realistically of what is the potential harm that this could cause.
Yes, that is so well said. And I have had variations of that exact conversation. I had, a really wonderful client come in who husband has a diagnosis of a really devastating genetic disease, Huntington's disease. And she was, desperately looking at the literature and on intermittent fasting and potential impact that this could have on her husband's quality of life. And my compassion, oh my gosh, my heart broke. And, I shared with her, I said, that it is this sort of cost benefit that right now, I don't know that we have any useful long-term data. And we have to really think very practically about what that science, how it looks under a microscope versus how it looks in a person's day-to-day quality of life. And that's something to know that is just as valid, if not more valid, than the conclusions drawn in that scientific paper.
Yeah, totally. And one of the things I really liked about the training, and it was the research, I didn't know about this, was around hypnosis and digestive issues. So do you want to talk a little about this? Because this was, pretty astounding.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing that up. So I will say that it was Lauren sharing the research on gut-directed hypnotherapy that my jaw dropped. And I said, Lauren, we have to be sharing this information with more people because I did not know this. And so the data that she shared with me was on some research studies that really compared efficacy on GI symptoms, looking at folks who were given a low FODMAP intervention. Do we want to talk about what FODMAP is or what that means?
Give a quick summary of that.
So it stands for fermentable oligomonosaccharides and polyols. So it's a classification or groups of carbohydrates that have become really notorious for creating GI symptoms, like this sort of nebulous GI symptoms like bloating and gas and stomach pain. And so what the research that Lauren pointed me to demonstrated that looking at a person going on a FODMAP diet versus a person or a group of people receiving gut-directed hypnotherapy is that the gut-directed hypnotherapy was actually just as efficacious and improving GI symptoms as compared to the FODMAP diet. And the FODMAP diet, we should say, is extremely difficult to follow. It is highly restrictive. It's not a protocol that I ever use for my clients because it is so restrictive. So it was fascinating to see that looking at the GI symptoms, that there was the abdominal pain, the bloating, the gas, the nausea, looking at satisfaction of stool consistency, which is something that you look at in GI research, that we had similar improvements. However, we saw an increase in improvement in anxiety and depression with the group that participated in the gut-directed hypnotherapy that we didn't see in the FODMAP diet group. So there was a sort of additional benefit that I don't know that the researchers were anticipating for utilizing the gut-directed hypnotherapy.
Yeah.
And so that was pretty exciting.
And I would say, like, since doing this and finding out about it, this has been a recommendation I've made with many clients, and there's probably only like one that really comes to mind where they didn't feel a major benefit from this. Like, everyone else is like, when I actually do the hypnosis on a daily basis or on a regular basis, I notice that my symptoms are better. I'm passing better stools. Like, things got it tracks that things are better when they keep doing this.
Yes. And that's really interesting, just sort of hearing your experience kind of anecdotally with your clients. One thing that I will say, one of the top questions I get from people who have ever heard me speak on this topic or who have taken my course are sort of, where do I get this hypnosis? Because it's not necessarily, quote unquote, easy to come by. I actually, as a result of reading this research, participated in kind of a level 1 training here in the Boston area on gut-directed hypnotherapy. So it's something I do have a bit of training in. I absolutely would not consider myself expert. But what I would say is, even approaching this from, even if you can't get a hold of gut-directed hypnotherapy recordings or protocols or clinicians, there are clinicians who are certified in this, even if you're not able to find someone in your area or to do it remotely, is that even just participating in guided meditation that is focused on helping you to move into more of a relaxed space is a fantastic start. Yeah. That we are realizing and learning more and more that through meditation and hypnotherapy, that we are able to connect that gut brain and that head brain, and that we can learn how to down-regulate the intensity of what is happening in our guts. Because individuals who tend to have more physical symptoms in their guts tend to be folks, I have my hands raised, who are lean in the direction of sort of, we feel things a lot. We are highly sensing people. We tend to move towards anxiety or stress very quickly. We tend to, I think, run on a little bit more cortisol and adrenaline. So I think it's about sort of teaching our bodies how to settle down, how to relax a little bit, how to down-regulate. And so I think not to be discouraged if you're not able to move into a more formalized treatment, because it's certainly not accessible to everyone.
Yeah, I can't. I'm blanking on the name of the app that I use with people. I think it's someone from Australia has put it together. I'll put it in the show notes.
And it's just put it in the show notes. I don't know that I know about that research. Thank you. Or that resource. Pardon me.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I will definitely share that. So let's shift focus now and talk about the second area, which is body image. So was this, I mean, I think you alluded to this earlier on, but was there any training on this whatsoever as part of your dietetics training?
Not at all. Not at even the slightest. I don't even know that I ever once heard the term body image ever used in my undergraduate or certainly I heard it a bit in my graduate work because it was a specialization in eating disorders, but I did not receive any training on how to work with negative body image. It was sort of like, yes, this is a diagnostic feature of an eating disorder, but in terms of, well, what do you do about it? Absolutely nothing.
Okay. And so, yeah, that part, the what you can do about it is something I want to explore. I guess to start with, do you have a working definition for what body image is, or how is it defined in the literature? Is there a agreed upon definition?
Oh my gosh, it was as if I just handed you that question. I'm so glad you asked that question because it is how I begin almost every one of my talks or workshops. And it is also how I begin with my clients and I think it's such an important question. What do we mean by body image? And what it means to me may be very different than what it means to my client. And so even using that as a place for exploration, as a way to start kind of quote unquote body image work, I think is so valuable. There are academic definitions. There's a kind of working definition that I keep in my own mind. And I think equally important is, how do the people that we work with, what does it mean to them? I will say academically, a sort of common definition of body image is a person's perception, and we can talk about what that word means, of their physical self and the thoughts and feelings that result from that perception. So we can think of it as this interplay between thoughts about one's body, feelings about one's body, perceptions or inner states or sensory experiences of one's body, and how that causes them to act in the world, feel in the world. So that's one way to think of it.
Yeah.
A more kind of simplistic way to think of it, how I often think of it kind of in my own mind, is the subjective experience or picture of one's own body. And I think kind of perception and subjectivity are very important words, because it speaks to the body image experience, which is not, concrete or sort of objective or fixed. It is highly malleable. It's changing. It waxes. It wanes. So those are some of the ways to think about what we mean when we say body image. I'd be curious to know, do you kind of have a working definition in your own mind, or kind of what it means for you?
That's a good question. I think it would be, it is kind of like a fuzzy idea. And I would say there is that part where it is a much more, as you say, around perception as opposed to reality. Mm-hmm. And whenever I'm talking with someone, it is, at least from my side of things, I'm trying to track, okay, how much does their perception track on to reality? And but in terms of a definition, I would probably struggle to come up with one, or it'd be one of those things I would ruminate on and then kind of muddle my way through if I was trying to write one out.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful that you're even able to identify that. And, what I encourage all clinicians who are possibly working on body image with their clients, or are interested in doing body image work with their clients, is to start there and say, gosh, what do I mean? Or what do I think that means? Or what does it mean to me? And to get, I think, less bogged down in what is the correct definition, and just connecting to the felt sense of it for yourself. And I have these very organic conversations with my clients, and how I might quote unquote define it one day might be different than another time I'm talking about with my clients. But I think the reflecting on it and getting kind of more clear in your own mind, gosh, when I say body image, what do I even think I mean by that? And to talk it through in an open way with the people you're working with. I'm teaching, as I mentioned, this graduate course on nutrition counseling for eating disorders. And just last week, we had our lecture on body image. And what we gave our students this activity to sort of pair up and write down the most exhaustive list they could possibly think about of all of the different factors that may inform a person's experience of their body or their body image. And we had a list. I regret I didn't take a picture of it. I think that there were probably 50 to 60 things written on the board.
Yeah.
Everything from medical diagnosis to social media messages to, family culture. You can imagine, right? This exhaustive list. And I think it really represented so beautifully why we do stumble on body image and why we have such a hard time getting our arms around it, because it is actually this entity which encompasses so many things, and that we hold in our bodies, we hold about our bodies, we feel in our bodies, that we think about our bodies. And so I think that we can have a lot of compassion around the sort of muddling through and sort of feeling lost, because it's filled with so many things that are so important, but also a lot of complexity.
Yeah. And I think part of the reason why I've struggled to answer is this isn't a question that I directly ask clients, and I'm definitely going to start doing it now that we've had this conversation. I mean, I talk a lot around body image and all of the different facets that come with it, but not as like just an overarching question of what does body image mean to you, that then has those, as you say, those organic conversations where you have a slightly different working definition every time you have a conversation with someone.
Yeah, very cool. I'll be interested to hear how those conversations go for you.
Yeah. And so as a clinician, then how do you assess body image? Is there like a checkbox thing that you go through? Are there specific questionnaires that you go through, or is it more of an organic process?
It's a wonderful question. I'm cracking up over here. You can't see me smiling because it's as if you are moving through the slide deck of the presentation I gave on Sunday. So this is a wonderful question. I gave a series of live body image workshops for clinicians with my wonderful colleague Fiona Sutherland. And in the process of the development of that workshop, I spent hours upon hours upon hours looking at the literature of body image assessments and looking at all of the tools that have been developed from a research standpoint, sort of these validated measures of how do we assess someone's body image. Several of those tools have actually been used in a book that's available to anyone. It's not a clinical book. It's not a book that's written for training clinicians. In a book called The Body Image Workbook by Thomas Cash. It's been around for a number of years.
I have this sitting on my desk. I was just about to ask you about that, so it's fine.
Yeah, you could spend some time with Thomas Cash's book, and he is, my gosh, almost like the father of body image research. He's been doing body image research for probably 30 years. And so the beginning of his book actually has a number of those assessment tools. And so there are lots of ways to assess for body image, and some of those tools I think are more useful than others. But I feel as a practitioner, that was a helpful way for me to get my start and build familiarity of how we can assess a person's experience of their body. But I would say that once I actually not only sort of used Thomas Cash's book, but went down the whole of reading the background of each of these assessment tools, I will save you the hours of doing that work. And I will tell you, each of those assessment tools are incredibly flawed.
Right.
They were actually developed many years ago with less thoughtfulness around weight bias, less thoughtfulness around cultural bias. And so I don't actually love any of those tools, not to say that they are completely useless. Like I said, I think it's can be a really useful place to start to kind of get to know this field a little bit more and get a little bit more comfortable. But now that I've been doing body image work for a while, I don't personally use any of those tools anymore. When I'm working with my clients, I have moved into a much more, what feels for me, organic process of talking with my clients. And I think I feel less of a pressure of getting the correct checkbox or asking the exact right question. But I do think I needed to go through a little bit of that learning process of one of the useful things of the assessment tools is it gives you a sense of the multiple dimensions that body image lives in and helps a clinician understand all of the different facets of how body image can be explored and assessed. But I think have moved into just, I think, a more comfortable place myself in assessing for body image. And I actually created a cheat sheet, which if you think it would be useful, I would be happy to give you a link to a website on my website where Definitely. I have this cheat sheet where anybody can download it. Doesn't matter if you're a practitioner or not, and a couple of research articles. So I can provide you with that link.
Yeah, that would be great. I probably discovered the Thomas Cash book in the last 6 to 9 months, and I use it with some clients and not others. I guess the thing that I find helpful with the assessments for clients is for them to understand what facets or what parts of body image are a struggle and what aren't.
Great.
Because it then can give certain language, or it can give a sort of a sharpening up or an awareness of, okay, where do I need to put my focus? Because sometimes body image work can be quite talked about as if like this thick brush stroke of, you've just got to do these 5 things and then you're going to feel better about yourself. And actually by using those assessment tools, you can see like, oh, okay, now I understand why that thing for you wasn't so much of a struggle, but you're really having an issue with this thing over here.
That's a great point. That's a really, really great point, that as it's sort of, because the assessments are, there are so many questions to answer, it opens up our understanding together as we do the work of all of the different areas and areas in which maybe they didn't realize that there were strengths.
Yep.
And that can feel good. And then I think it, like you said, it can give direction to, okay, where are we going to go with this? And a person might be able to look at the results of their assessment and say, I actually really would like to begin here. This place is very meaningful for me, and I'd like to begin on this part. So it can be clarifying, and it can be directing. And I think that I'm so appreciative of you sharing your experience. That's great.
Yeah. And I think for me, a lot of the times or the work I do around this is find areas of cognitive dissonance where you're like, okay, you say that this thing doesn't bother you, but this other thing does. And I want to understand how those two things can sit together, because I know that thing that you say doesn't bother you, it bothers a lot of other clients. So how are you able to just walk away from that and that not be a thing? And then, okay, this thing that really does bother you, could you imagine it not bothering someone? Okay, so how do they manage to do that? And sort of use those two areas that are kind of at odds with one another to get them to understand how they can make changes.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's great. That sounds like really fruitful work.
Yeah. And one of I went through as part of looking at this course for doing the questions for today. And one of the modules, I know you spend time on looking at the importance of words, and the words really matter. And you alluded to that earlier when talking about maybe some of the problems with the cash book or with the questionnaires as part of that in using the wrong language. So, yeah, are you able to just talk a little bit about what is covered as part of that module and why you think this is so important?
Sure. Oh, I'm happy to. I think that I try my best when I'm in conversation with my clients or when I'm on a podcast to be mindful of my language and the words that I use, because I think language not only has sort of the direct meaning of a word, right, but also the connotation or associations that we have with those words, sometimes that we're aware of consciously and sometimes we're not even aware of, sort of lives in a below level of conscious type of a place. And we live in a medical culture and in a social culture that speaks about bodies in ways that are incredibly problematic. And I think that those experiences have impact on a person's self-image and sense of their body. And so from a medical standpoint, words that are often used to describe higher weight bodies, such as quote unquote overweight or obese, are inherently pathologizing, or inherently sort of placing illness or assuming a problem based on a higher weight size. And I think it's important, particularly for myself as someone who tries to support other people, to remedy some of that, right? So if we say the body is overweight, that's assuming a standardized assumption of, there is a narrow set of weights that are acceptable, and sort of erases the notion of body diversity, and that we are actually meant to live in a society where we do have body diversity. And then the normative idea is, no, we are all meant to sort of be squished together in this narrow range of BMIs. And there's actually more and more literature coming out to challenge that. But that's the prevailing narrative. The word obese assumes illness based on size. And we know that illness spans all body sizes. And that as human beings, none of us are going to be able to prevent any and all illness simply by managing the size of our bodies. And so those are things that I try to work on in training professionals, but also work on with my clients. And those are open dialogues and open conversations that I have the luxury of having because I get to have long-term relationships with many of my clients, and also getting curious with them about ways in which their bodies have been spoken about by perhaps family members over time, and ways in which they've learned to speak about their own bodies in ways that are inherently judgmental or shaming. And learning to be able to speak about and be in relationship with our bodies in ways that are more neutral or more descriptive has its own way of being healing. So those are some of the thoughts that I have.
Sure. And do you notice by having these conversations with clients and getting them to use different labels when talking about size or whatever, that is being helpful for them to move past or get better with body image?
Yes. I would say particularly for my clients who are in higher weight bodies. And one of the things that it has helped them to do is shift essentially where the finger is pointed. For people particularly who are in higher weight bodies, the finger has always been pointed at their bodies as the problem. And it helps to shift and locate the problem outside of themselves and point the problem in the structures and in the systems and in the politics that live outside of us. And I think that for some people that can feel very liberating. Now, it doesn't, of course, extinguish all negative body image. I don't even think that's the goal of body image work necessarily. But it helps to sort of shift the balance of quote unquote blame. And I think that can be, for some people, very healing.
Yeah. And I know we're running out of time, so I just want to ask one more sort of practical question that someone could take with them. Like, are there examples of body image interventions for eating disorder clients that you can give? I think some of these may be talked about as part of the course that you've got. Like, are there any that come to mind that you want to talk about?
Oh, sure. I'm more than happy to share a few ideas. And I think before I do that, one thing that I will offer to your listeners is to think about, and I hinted to this just a moment ago, that from my vantage point, working on negative body image isn't with the goal of always feeling positive regard towards your body or feeling positive about your appearance. That is impossible. It would be a goal that you would always feel that you're failing at, another standard that can't be met, and we don't want that. I often compare it to the goal of going to therapy isn't so that we only feel happiness and never feel sadness.
Yeah.
And I think about being in relationship to body image, and that's one of the kind of tools I try to help my clients build, is being in relationship to your body image experience. And one of the practices that I teach is I encourage people to make a list of, think about first one of the best relationships that you have in your life, whether it's a partner or a friend or a colleague, that you feel like this is really representative of an incredibly strong, healthy relationship that's very functional. And if you could write down as many of the characteristics of that relationship as you can, and think about, I'm also in relationship to my body image, and how do I begin to try to cultivate some of those same characteristics. So often people will say, dependability, or sort of kindness, or offering compassion. And what are the things that right now you are able to do or not able to do that helps to build some of those qualities? And that can be a useful place to begin. And it's not that you don't ever have bumps in those relationships, or you don't ever have disagreements, or times in which you're incredibly annoyed or disappointed or frustrated. That's the natural part of any relationship. But it also has some of these other key characteristics that make it a lifelong, hopefully thriving, functional relationship. So that's sort of one piece that I would offer, is to begin to maybe conceptualize a relationship to one's body image. I am a believer that perhaps the most important skill that a person can develop in trying to heal their relationship with their body image is cultivating the skill of self-compassion. And that is for a couple of reasons. Self-compassion in the literature is actually correlated with individuals who have a more positive body image. So we know there's sort of something there in that relationship.
Yep.
But self-compassion gives us the capacity to be able to build a little bit of insulation between ourselves and what lives outside of us, because we know what lives outside of us as it relates to body messaging is incredibly harmful and toxic. It also really increases our capacity to move towards positive and healing change. And we also know that it's correlated to improved psychological and emotional well-being. So fundamentally, it gives us a baseline to build towards engaging with ourselves and our experience of our body in a way that is truly healing and I believe empowering. So that's actually a place that I guide myself to, as well as practitioners and individuals. And so even going to, you can Google, I think it's selfcompassion.org, Kristen Neff's website.
Site?
Yes,
yeah.
Kristen Neff's website. And even just beginning there and finding a way of relating to self-compassion that feels natural and that feels authentic. It's not necessarily going to feel like the right fit if you just listen to maybe Kristen's meditation. Maybe that doesn't resonate for you, but find ways in which it can feel real, feel authentic. And that is, I think, a cornerstone of body image work. Another piece that I would highlight to listeners and to take very seriously, even though this isn't new advice, is to diversify and get very, very selective about the media that you bring into your life. We are inundated, even the areas in which we don't have the ability to choose, right? We are inundated with messages that are meant to leave us feeling badly about our appearance. So we have to be proactive. We know in looking at the research related to positive body image that there are some core facets that are correlated with a more positive body image. One of those is having a broad conceptualization of what beauty is. So being able to broaden your definition and where are ways in which you might find beauty in hidden places rather than the sort of narrow version of beauty that is fed to us.
Yep.
So those are some of the, I think, beginning key pieces that can help a person kind of begin on their journey.
Nice. On the self-compassion end of things, I mean, yeah, Kristen Neff is someone who I'll recommend, and then Tara Brach is the other one. And they have slightly different tones to one another. So I'll often recommend both of them, or if someone doesn't get on with one of them, I'm like, oh, check out this other one, because their messaging, I mean, it's not completely the same, but it covers a lot of the same stuff, but they just seem to attack it slightly differently.
I am so appreciative that you mentioned Tara Brach's work. So often the pieces, I was trying to be concise, but the pieces that I recommend are self-compassion practice and mindfulness-based practice.
Yep.
And I know so many people do not love the word mindfulness. I will tell you, I had a long process myself in getting on board with even the concept of mindfulness, and for many years found it really obnoxious. But I will tell you that Tara Brach's book, Radical Acceptance, I believe is the title of the book.
I'm pretty sure that's the one. Yep.
Yeah. So I can spot check it and make sure we get the accurate title for your show notes. Was truly transformative for me in body image counseling. Now, it's not a perfect book. There are ways that she actually writes about food that I find problematic.
I think the same thing about Kristen Neff as well. Yeah,
I fully agree. There are parts woven throughout Kristen Neff's book on self-compassion that I cringed. I was like, oh no, we have these wonderful, wise authors and, thought leaders, and they are really missing it when it comes to food and weight. But if you are able to sort of take the pieces in there that work for you, like you said, the whole book isn't going to resonate. But I think that there are pieces in there that apply so beautifully to body image work, particularly, Tara Brach's work on being able to tolerate and being with, in a compassionate way, things that are inherently painful. Because there are things that are inherently painful about having a body. And it's about learning to live in relationship to those things with greater self-compassion and skill that I think is really key.
Yeah. Well, look, Marci, this has been wonderful. We've covered a lot. Where I know I've made reference a couple of times to your courses, and I highly recommend that people go check them out. But yeah, where do you want me to be directing people? Where should they go to find out more information about you?
Oh, thank you. On social media, I'm Marci RD everywhere, MARCIRD. My website is marcird.com, and I think that's probably the easiest place for folks to go. If individuals or clinicians, really my trainings are designed for clinicians, but I've actually had individuals take them for themselves, especially people who haven't had access to treatment, and let me know that they felt helpful. They're not designed to be treatment, but I found that interesting. But you can learn about my trainings on my website, and that will direct you to a landing page. All of my trainings live on a teachable website, but you can learn about them on my website. And I also will mention that if it's of interest, I do have free resources digitally on my website, a few resources that individuals can use. So it's in the drop-down menu as they click on clinician or individual. Some meditations and I think some tools that will hopefully be of use both for the practitioner side as well as for folks who aren't practitioners as well.
Perfect. Well, look, I will put all of that in the show notes. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was great.
I really appreciate the invitation. This has been such a rich and wonderful conversation, and it's very meaningful to me. So thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.